In the mid and late 1960s, Pontiac Motor Division was riding high, and in 1968, the division hit an all-time record in terms of sales, selling about 894,000 units in that particular year alone. But as the late 1960s transitioned into the early 1970s, Pontiac Division sales plummeted, particularly with the launch of its 1970 full-size lineup, where the front end, shall we say, had, well, an acquired taste at best. Division sales plummeted, and in 1970, Pontiac sold just about 500,000 units versus the 894,000 that had sold in the 1968 model year. Division sales did recover, and by 1978, Pontiac hit its all-time record year, selling 896,000 vehicles. By this point, the brand was not quite what it used to be, and divisional sales slipped yet again to about 500,000 units in the 1982 model year. With the birth of its We Build Excitement campaign in the mid-1980s, Pontiac did capture back some of its magic. And in 1986, it hit its third best all-time sales year at 841,000 units. However, after 1986, Pontiac never got its magic back. And from 1986 through the brand's demise, sales plummeted pretty significantly, though they did stabilize for a short period of time in the mid and late 1990s. So what happened to Pontiac, and why did it meet its demise? And also, what happened to General Motors that had experienced such significant financial hardship and eventually went bankrupt? We sit down with former auto industry titan Bob Lutz, who capped his career as the vice chairman of General Motors from 2001 to 2010. Bob shed some insights on what happened and why the General faltered, and also a few things that it did right over the years. Let's listen in. Well, welcome back to Rare Classic Cars. We have another treat. Bob Lutz is back. So, Bob, I don't think you really need much of an introduction.
No, you can skip it.
I can skip it?
Yeah.
I think the viewers of the channel know Bob quite well, and he's gracious enough to sit down again with us. By the early 70s, Pontiac had lost a bit of that flair, certainly on the full-size cars.
Well, it got into that big GM blend of everything's the same except ornamentation, and why anybody thought that would work without damaging the brands. Then that was the area where General Motors basically damaged all its brands. Irreparably damaged Oldsmobile, which had to be taken out. Buick was later almost on life support, but was brought back. Cadillac is still struggling to come back, and Chevrolet was always kind of okay because it was the lowest price of the GM lineup and represented a lot of value. But of course today exists on pickup trucks and sport utilities. So it's, what they do with sedans is kind of moot. But it was a bad era for GM, and it was an era where the car guys, I mean, the people who had any sense of automobiles or sense for the public and public taste and so forth, any awareness of what competition was doing, they were absent from GM. And GM was basically a financial institution that was transferring money in and via products that they sold, hopefully getting more money out at the other end.
Got it. Yeah, it's amazing to me. You go from having that beautiful 63 Grand Prix, 65, 66 full-size lineup. I think, at least to me, the start of the decline might be the 70 full-size cars with the horn, the big grille in the middle.
Yeah.
And then it becomes this, as you said, kind of badge-engineered vehicle from that point till almost.
It was sad. Well, it was unfortunate, and it didn't have to happen. But it does come from the brand being owned by a company where nobody at a senior level was a car guy. Nobody knew what Pontiac meant. Nobody had a realization of what Pontiac meant to the public. They were just not in tune with the marketplace, and they were running GM to be as convenient as possible for GM, as opposed to focusing on the desires of the buying public.
When you were at Chrysler, what was your opinion of Pontiac? Did it even register, or was it a benchmark car? Or
no, it was not at that time. This was, late 60s, all through the 70s. I mean, we honestly sometimes would joke that it was our ambition to be number two, but we thought we would have to beat General Motors rather than Ford because everything that GM brought out was lackluster. There was one four-door Grand Prix in, I think it was the early 90s, the one that looked really nice.
The second generation rebirth of the wide track, that Grand Prix,
It was front-wheel drive car, but it had very European lines.
I think that's the 90 came out in 96, I want to say, as a 97 model.
And the interior was bad and the fits and finishes were awful, but the basic styling of the car was terrific. It was the one well-styled Pontiac of a whole era of cars that were eminently forgettable.
I have to chuckle because that Grand Prix you just pointed out, I think was the only car, Pontiac of that era, that didn't have the ribs on it. It was clean.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
And so John Manoogian, who's been on the program, was the designer of it. And he said purposefully he didn't want any ribs. He was forced at the last minute to put some on. And he put two little strakes on the front fascia and the rear fascia and nothing on the sides.
Yeah, good.
So I guess you weren't a fan of the ribs that came out then in the mid 80s on the 85 Grand Am.
It was a failed attempt at establishing brand character using something that meant nothing to nobody.
So you get to GM, Pontiac continues its downward trajectory, aside from the 97 Grand Prix. And then you arrive and the portfolio doesn't have much spark. You try to reinvigorate it with the Solstice, as you said, and then the transition to the G, 6, G8.
Well,
what was the thought process there?
The G6 was almost finished when I got there.
Okay.
It just had a grill that was bad, and I asked him to modify the grill and give it more character, more prominence, and that was done. And then we redid the interior kind of at the last minute and upgraded it.
It was going to be another My First Interior by Play School?
Yeah, it was going to be another black plastic interior, grainy black plastic, or I always call it solidified lava.
How did that happen at GM? Where did that come from?
It started when it became legitimate to do all black as opposed to the bright, bright interiors that the American cars used to have with the red crash pads and wood and chrome and ribbed aluminum everywhere. And that started when BMW and Mercedes and Volkswagen did the all-black interiors. But those were all-black interiors using noble materials, using real leather or high-end protein vinyl and a lot of flat black paint and so forth, to where they were black, but they looked noble. And somebody at GM must have decided, well, hell, we can do that. So, but then it was executed in unpainted, untreated, poorly grained, shiny black plastic with huge knobs, and everybody convinced themselves that these interiors were world class because on J.D. Power, we had very few complaints about the functioning of interior parts. That means the blower,
they worked.
Everything worked. The switches worked, but the stalks were awful. The rotary switches for the climate control were like made by Mattel, and they sounded like something Mattel would make. They go clack, clack, clack.
It's the My First Interior.
I mean, everything about the GM interiors screamed cheap, cheap, cheap. And when I rejoined GM in 2001, I'd go to cocktail parties and I'd people say, "Well, you're at GM now." Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I just sort of casually ask, what do you drive? And the guy said, I drive a BMW or a Mercedes or a Lexus. And I say, why don't you drive a GM car? He says, I occasionally do when I'm on a business trip and I rent a GM car and I open the door and look in and I tell myself, thank God I don't have to do this every day. And I mentioned this at GM to, including Rick Wagner, and I said, what do you think is the biggest problem with our cars? I said, well, the biggest glaring thing is the interiors. And he said, what's wrong with the interiors? I said, Rick, have you looked at interiors of the Japanese competition, or even have you looked at Chrysler products or a Jeep Grand Cherokee interior compared to what we're putting out there? I says, well, no, I haven't, but I'm told our interiors are very good because we have good J.D. Power scores. I said, that's the absence of things gone wrong. But what we're missing is things gone right. Appeal. Have an interior where the customer is happy to sit behind the wheel and look at all that goodness and remind himself that this is all mine. Look at this beautifully crafted interior. So then we had a great big push on interiors in general, which of course put some cost in, so it wasn't exactly popular with the finance people. As an aside, but during my tenure in product development at GM, between suspension, brakes, more precise steering, noise, vibration, and harshness, more sound deadening, interior materials, improved paint, addition of more tasteful chrome moldings on the outside of the car. I probably added close to $1,000 a unit on average.
Wow.
Shocking. But
that's hurting my heart, Bob, as a bean counter.
But get this, and everybody forecast financial disaster because margins were so low in the first place.
Yep.
And the generation of cars with the more goodness in them, the average transaction price went up by $5,000. So up 5 minus 1 is a net plus of $4,000. And the same thing happened to one of the big pizza chains. It shall remain nameless, but it's a big one. And I knew the CEO, and he had taken over at a time when sales were declining, so they were taking cost out of the boxes, cost out of the flour, cost out of the cheese, cost out of the pepperoni.
Tastes really good, right?
And it was a race toward the bottom. And then he went out and started personally interviewing a bunch of pizza eaters, and people said, I don't care how cheap your pizza is, I'm not going to eat that shit. And he bought some at various outlets of the company, and he could see the thin crust and the thin toppings and everything. And he went back to the office, and he told the master central baking and pizza expert, the head of product development, as it were, what's wrong with our pizzas? The guy says, they're lousy. He says, well, why? Well, because I keep getting told to take more and more cost out as our margins decline and as our volume tanks. I take more and more cost out to try to compensate, and then even more customers stay away.
And the margin declines more.
Yeah. And so the guy says, well, if I were to let every pizza cost $1.50 more, would you know what to do? He says, absolutely. He says, well, make me a couple like that. And he made a couple like that, and they were delicious. And then they followed the 80-20 rule, of the $1.50 or $1.25. They probably added 40 cents, the 40 cents that really mattered, and the other stuff they didn't do. And sales went up, margins went up, market share went back up. And so sometimes if you're constantly taking cost out to compensate for the decline in margins, you're just heading for the tank. And at some point, you've got to tell yourself, wait a minute, this is not working. And then you have to take the bold step and actually add cost at a time when you don't like to do it, and things turn around. And then when everything's great again, the bean counters say, I think
Too successful.
I think we overreacted.
That's
here.
right.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah. You overreacted.
We need to take some cost back out.
Yeah, I noticed you kept. You didn't say the bean counters before. You were trying to dance around it. Take costs out, but it was the bean counter.
Well, sometimes it's the engineers themselves. I mean, in large corporations, everybody is so trained to eliminate cost, and I was too. Unnecessary cost. Unnecessary cost, to me, shouldn't be in there in the first place. And you know it as well as I do, in large corporations, there is unnecessary cost wherever you look. But when it's necessary cost that makes the product better or gives you an edge to the competition, that's not unnecessary cost. And many people can't tell the difference.
Hope you enjoyed this interview with Bob Lutz. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.